So hi all, thank you very much for joining today, and it's a real pleasure to be able to present some of my work at CUSP. So today I'm going to introduce two different subdomains of research, one from the lens of geographical psychology and one from urban informatics. I'll then discuss a specific application of this work to the case study of New York and show how novel data sources and advanced computational methods can help drive new insights for this field. And this background image on the title page is something I'll return to later in the presentation. And it's quite interesting because it really relates to the source of a lot of this data, which is Flickr imaging data. And we'll discuss what it demonstrates in terms of the use of images as a form of perception and self-expression for city residents. So to briefly introduce myself, I'm a master's student at University College London in the Centre for Behaviour Change. So I'm working on a number of different projects there at the moment. But this current work that I'm presenting really came from my time at Cambridge, and it kind of formed the basis of my undergraduate dissertation. And it's just been something I've sort of been chipping away at over the past year with a number of collaborators in London and across in the US as well. So I'm going to start off by outlining some of the research from geographical psychology, which underpins this work on sort of personality within cities. I'll then discuss the concept of urban ambience, which is kind of rooted in urban informatics. And then finally, I'll discuss my current research and some of the potential implications of my findings. So quite briefly, but geographical psychology is concerned with the spatial distribution of psychological phenomena. And in particular, it looks at how individual characteristics, social entities, and physical features of an environment contribute to this distribution. And one kind of quite prominent sort of domain within geographical psychology is this idea of personality. So the interactive aggregate of personal characteristics that influence an individual's response to the environment. And several studies, it's sort of a growing area of research now, but several studies have focused on personality. And what's often kind of shared across many of these studies is the framework which they use to do so. And that framework, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is called the Big Five. So this is the Big Five, or the Ocean Framework, and it's a well-established empirical framework for classifying and measuring personality. It's widely used in social psychology. So I'll briefly outline the 5 traits here and some of the sort of descriptors that we might use for them. So it ranges from sort of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And generally this will be assessed through a self-reported questionnaire utilizing like a 1 to 7 Likert scale, and it'll be an inventory of different questions. So this work actually used something called the 44 item BFI. So it's a 44 question survey which people fill in themselves, and they receive a score for each of these different personality traits. And the idea is that these are parsimonious. So traits shouldn't really overlap, and each sort of trait is kind of unique in terms of what it characterizes about an individual. And like I said, this has sort of led to a proliferation of research over the last 5 to 10 years, which focuses on geographical personality differences. And as you can see from some of the journal titles here, it's actually quite cross-disciplinary, this work. So we've got stuff in Nature Human Behavior, environmental psychology, and then personality. And essentially that kind of represents the fact that it has united quite a lot of different researchers who can use it as like an umbrella in which to conduct research into human behavior. So this paper in Nature Human Behavior actually looked at how regional ambient temperature in different areas across the world, looking at the US and China, leads to differences in personality factors. And then these more recent papers, both published in the last few weeks, actually were looking at, the first down here by Frederick Gotts, looked at walkability and extroversion and agreeableness in Japan. And then this paper by JOKELA looked at sort of selective differences in mobility. So this was really looking at how neighborhood personality differences are arising over time. And it was looking at residential mobility over a 30-year period and how that led to differences in neighborhood personality. And I'm going to actually sort of focus on one particular study for this talk, which was by JOKELA et al. In 2015. And this was probably the first paper which really looked at within city personality differences. So up until this work, a lot of the research was looking across countries, across regions, but not within a city. And this was a very interesting paper looking at personality and life satisfaction in London. So essentially what they did, they took a large scale survey of 56,000 residents across London districts, and they could look at the level of ward and zip code, which is around about 600 wards across London. And they basically build up these cluster maps, which I've displayed on the right-hand side of the slide. And essentially the areas represented in red are the higher levels of a given trait, and the areas represented in blue are the lower levels of that given trait. So if we have a look, for example, at openness to experience, we can see that there's a high clustering of individuals who show high openness to experience in the middle of city. And this idea of the urban centre is something we'll address as well later in the presentation. And what this paper was sort of, what it also found, which was very interesting, was basically this interaction between individual and neighbourhood level personality. So essentially, if I, for example, am high in openness, and I choose to live in an area, a neighbourhood, which is also characterised by high openness, then the association with life satisfaction increased. So essentially, the strength of association between personality and life satisfaction seems to be driven by an interaction at the individual neighbourhood level. And it was a really interesting paper. I remember reading it. It was sort of my motivation actually for applying to study psychology at Cambridge. And it's sort of formed the basis of my undergraduate work as well. So we'll return to this quite soon. Okay, so this is the sort of work on geographical psychology and personality. And then this has kind of been coupled by work in urban informatics. So most of the audience will be very familiar with this sort of definition and these terms, but for anyone who's less familiar with this field, essentially urban informatics is looking at how rich behavioural data from cities and urban environments can be analysed and understood through computational methods. And it's been informed by sort of three main domains, those being people, place, and technology. And this work, which I'll be going into in more depth, really kind of fits between people and place in some ways. So it's looking at city residents, and it's looking at how they characterize the places in which they live. And this sort of work is therefore under the umbrella of urban ambience. Basically, the urban ambience literature kind of characterizes cities in terms of these like spirits or different ways of trying to conceptualize how a neighborhood feels to the people who visit it and to the people who live there. And it's an outcome of a complex composition of physical, physiological, psychological and sociological criteria. But we're just interested today on the sort of psychological criteria lens. And basically the computational methods over the sort of last 5 to 10 years have really enhanced our way of sort of thinking about urban ambience. And there's been some very interesting work, for example, on looking at the user profiles of people who have visited locations and trying to infer urban ambience that way. Also by looking at Airbnb photos. And finally, by looking at geo-referenced Flickr tags, which is what this work has focused on. And although like there's been a real proliferation of research into urban ambience, I would say in the last maybe 10 years, this isn't like it's not a new topic as such. This is something that urbanists have been kind of discussing for generations. And even this sort of quote here from Kevin Lynch's quite important book, The Image of the City from the 1960s, sort of demonstrates the idea that there is this interplay between observer and between city and the way that we represent cities. And this brings me back to the image which I showed on the title page, which I think is a really great photo, just showing the sort of juxtaposition that a lot of communities and cities now kind of experience. So we've got obviously a dilapidated graffiti building right next to a new kind of urban high-rise. And these are some of the hashtags which were associated with this image on the Flickr site that it had been uploaded to. So it's in Hackney Wick, this is actually in London. And it's around sort of gentrification, graffiti, and urban development. And I think it's a really good way of demonstrating that what we can access from imaging data is often beyond what we might access from survey data, in that residents or visitors have a very easy way of sort of conceptualizing how they are experiencing a place beyond the sort of data available from a lot of survey methods. So I think it's a really exciting area, which brings me to the other sort of important paper which has underpinned this work, which was conducted by the team at Nokia Bell Labs back in 2018. And it was a really interesting project which basically looked at how we could use Flickr imaging data to kind of capture neighborhood ambience and conceptualize it. And essentially what the team did, they built a taxonomy of terms which were related to 13 ambience dimensions. So these are characterized on the right-hand side of the slide here. And essentially there'd be a grouping of terms which were positively associated and a terms which were negatively associated with a given ambience dimension. And then they use this taxonomy to understand how different Flickr images, or like the hashtags specifically that people had uploaded, linked to this taxonomy. So essentially there were geo-referenced picture tags from Flickr, and they looked at the terms that had been used in these hashtags and basically used this to conceptualize and map urban ambience for London. So this was a really interesting way of being able to look across an entire city and see how, you know, different neighborhoods are characterized in terms of the imaging data supplied by residents and visitors of those neighborhoods. Cool, so I'm just going to take a quick glass of water. So that brings me to my current research, which was basically looking at these two main papers by JOKELA and by Reddy et al. And looking at maybe a sort of coupling between them to see how urban ambience and personality interacts. So my three main research questions which underpin this were the following. So is there systematic variation in neighborhood personality scores in New York City? Can the ambience of New York neighborhoods be mapped using Flickr data? And then finally, is there a relationship between personality and urban ambience at the neighborhood level? So the first of these questions, I followed quite a similar approach to JOKELA et al. And I was actually working with something called the OOS personality dataset. And this has been running for about 15 years now. It's about 3.7 million participants in the dataset and growing across the whole of the United States. And I essentially took a small sample of that dataset, just looking at New York, which came to around 36,000 participants. I then aggregated that at the zip code level, which you can see on the leftmost image of this screen. And the reason it looks a little bit patchy in that first image is that we applied an exclusion criteria. So any zip code with less than 100 participants was excluded from analysis. And that's basically to ensure that spurious results don't affect our sort of mean level scores. And then we performed a crosswalk and brought it up to a community district level. So that's the middle image you can see here. There's around 56 community districts and about 190 zip codes. And finally, we also looked at the borough level, so another crosswalk. And essentially, this gives us 3 different levels of spatial analysis to look at whether or not this systematic variation exists. And I mean, just looking at this visually, you can see what appears to be clustering. So, for example, in the middle image, you can see heightened levels of openness towards the city kind of urban center around Manhattan, around areas of Queens as well, towards the top there, and Brooklyn. And then you can see declining levels of openness as we kind of reach the outer regions of the city. But we can actually go one better than simply sort of visually looking at it. And we can run something called a spatial autocorrelation test. And this is, or sometimes referred to as a Moran's I statistic. And basically this gives us a number ranging from -1 to +1, which demonstrates the clustering of values. So a value of -1 would be perfect dispersion. So it would be completely dispersed in a perfect manner. A value of 0 would show no clustering whatsoever, so completely random. And then a value of +1 shows perfect clustering of similar values. So you can see here, I've ran a sort of Moran's I statistic. I've actually done it for all of the 5 personality traits, and I compared it across to London. And what we find, which is very interesting, is that similar sort of patterns of clustering across both cities. Not only that, but the ordering of the Moran's I statistic is the same in both cases. So the most clustered trait was experience, followed by agreeable and then neuroticism and conscientiousness. And this idea kind of shows this idea here around the urban center. So it's the notion that openness is associated with interest and tolerance for alternative lifestyles and ideas. And these sort of dispositions seem to characterize residents of populated urban areas. And that's kind of been demonstrated empirically first by JOKELA and now by this current work. And like I said, we've also got these results for the personality traits. And as we move through as well, we can see here urban Centre again seems to play a role in agreeableness. And now this is like kind of a flip side. So it appears that the clustering of low levels of agreeable people is toward the centre of the city, and then slightly higher levels towards the outer regions and suburbs. And this JOKELA et al. Explained through a notion of urban alienation, which basically suggests that residents of highly densely populated urban areas tend to be less considerate towards other people. And then finally, for our last two traits, conscientiousness and neuroticism, the clustering is less prominent, but still significant. And again, it's interesting to see how closely aligned they are across the two cities that we studied. Okay, so my sort of second main research question was, can the ambience of New York neighborhoods be mapped using Flickr data? And to do this, I basically drew upon the methodologies used by Nokia Bell Labs, and I presented them here on the left-hand side of the slide. And to kind of describe this as simply as possible, I'm going to use an example just from one community district. So if we're looking at community district Manhattan, so Manhattan #1, so in the sort of middle of this image here, and let's just imagine we're just looking at one dimension of an ambience. So this dimension is the alternative dimension. Okay, so the way we kind of do this, we look at our full data set of Flickr images, and each image will have a number of associated Flickr tags, which the user will have uploaded when they uploaded their image. We then essentially select tags that fit into our taxonomy of terms. In this example, those would be those that fit under the positive category or the negative category of the alternative dimension. We then basically perform a count function at our given spatial unit, so in this case, Manhattan #1, to work out how many positive terms there are and how many negative terms there are. Next, we basically normalize across all districts by removing the mean score and then dividing by the standard deviation, which gives us a normalized positive and negative score. And then finally, we can calculate our neighborhood ambience score by minusing the negative score from the positive score. So essentially, the reason we kind of use both positive and negative terms is to make sure that it's not simply an artifact of there being a lot of different points of interest within a community. For example, if we just use positive terms for each of our dimensions, we'd have no way of accounting for the fact that some community districts are simply going to have more reasons to take images essentially than other community districts. So that's kind of one way we've used to account for this is basically proposed by Nokia Bell Labs to use these positive and negative terms. Great, so this was our methodology, and these were some of the findings. So this is just taken from my undergraduate dissertation, and I'm going to use a laser pointer here to highlight some of the notable points. So we started off with around 10 million Flickr images. We had some 95 million associated tags, and this is just for New York. So this is from the overall US dataset. We're just looking at New York here. And then we filtered through our ambience taxonomy. So here I've demonstrated some of the terms we've used. There's actually 13 dimensions in total, both positive and negative for each dimension. And that brought the dataset down to a slightly more manageable 6 million associated tags. We again applied an exclusionary criteria, so at least 100 tags per given zip code. And then you can see here the sort of distribution. So there were some zip codes which obviously showed a lot more tags. For example, this one, which is actually Manhattan, and others. But we kind of used both the zip code, community district, and borough level in our analysis. Okay, and this is just a map of some of the findings. So here I've basically taken all of the ambience dimensions of interest and rated them on each spatial unit. So this is at the community district level. And essentially you can see here the most prominent dimension for any given community district. So if we look, for example, in Manhattan in the center of the image, we can see it characterized by the lively and modern ambience dimensions as being the most prominent. As we move up towards the Bronx, we can see the alternative dimension becoming more important. And then around on the outskirts of like Queens and of Staten Island, the unique dimension becomes more important, as does the quiet dimension. So this slightly psychedelic map is a really interesting way of kind of showing all of these different dimensions in one place, but obviously there's also the distribution of each dimension separately. So there's separate maps for each distribution showing, you know, for example, alternative across the whole city. Cool. And then the final kind of research question I had was, is there a relationship between personality and neighbourhood ambience? And this has been something I've been kind of chipping away at over the past year and has essentially been explored using the following methods. So starting off with quite simple, just correlational analysis. We then ran regressions and spatial regressions, and then finally conditional random forest analysis. So our correlation analysis was just looking at personality traits and ambience dimensions. And I've highlighted here the traits dimensions, which remain significant across both levels of spatial analysis. So this is both at the zip code level and at the community district level. And one particularly notable relationship was between openness trait and alternative dimension. So we see it rising to 0.469 in the community district level, and in both cases it remained highly significant. And it's something we're actually going to discuss a little bit further in terms of regressions, just so that we can kind of pick out one. But it should be noted that there's a number of other sort of relationships which emerged here, and we have been exploring those as well. So obviously correlation analysis gives us some sort of indicator of what might be important to look into, but it doesn't allow us to count for any control variables. So to do so, we moved on to conducting regression analysis, which basically included our personality traits and then a number of selected demographic variables and land use data from New York City. So we started off using an OLS sort of simple regression. However, the post-estimation test of spatial autocorrelation found that the residuals in our regression analysis were spatially clustered. And essentially this violates the assumptions of an OLS regression model, which is that residuals are independent of each other. So to account for this, we instead applied a spatial weight matrix and conducted a spatial lag model, which is a form of spatial regression. And this basically allows us to produce unbiased estimates of the coefficients and significance of our predictor variables. And I'm sorry for the very messy output table. This is a work in progress. But essentially you can see here, just for the dimension of alternative, this is the range of different personality traits, firstly, then demographic variables, and then as we move down, it's sort of land use data. So like some of the sort of indicators that New York provides on what the data land use has been used for. So to point a couple of notable predictors here, what we found was that alongside openness, which was found in the kind of correlations, we also have agreeableness as playing some role. But interestingly, we also have a lot of other variables which emerged as positive predictors. And what this kind of demonstrates for the alternative dimension, which is particularly interesting if we think about how that's conceptualized in terms of sort of creativity, in terms of like different neighborhoods, is that we have sort of positive predictors such as educational attainment, but alongside unemployment rate. And similarly, we have negative predictors, income, but also poverty. So these aren't necessarily wealthy areas, but neither are they under the sort of poverty line. And similarly, they seem to be occupied by sort of high levels of well-educated individuals who aren't necessarily employed in conventional jobs, which potentially gives them more time to sort of dedicate to community engagement and projects which kind of increase this alternative atmosphere within an area. So there's just some quite interesting sort of findings for this dimension, and it's something we're sort of looking into further. And then finally, so although our spatial regression models give us estimations of sort of coefficient sizes, etc., we still face some quite important assumptions which are violated. So one of the main problems with spatial analysis is when we move to our spatial unit. So we started off in this project with some 36,000 residents and 10 million Flickr imaging tags. But our final data set is reduced to 56 community districts. So basically to account for this sort of large P small n problem, where we have fewer data points but lots of different features to control for, we can use something called conditional random forest analysis. And basically this is like a robustness check. So it allows us to show which variables exceed some important threshold, but it doesn't allow us to infer directionality. So here we can see for the analysis for the alternative dimension, we can see again, openness emerges as an important variable. And basically every variable to the right-hand side of this red line shows some level of variable importance. So it exceeds the variable importance threshold, and it's something we'd want to look into further. And I've basically mapped this just here for the alternative dimension. And on the following slide, I've mapped this for all 13 dimensions. So if you imagine this graph being superimposed onto the following graph, you will be able to see all dimensions and all variables of interest. So like I said, so if you imagine the previous graph being superimposed here, we have the sort of most important variable on the right-hand side, and then moving across to the vertical line here, this is all of the variables which exceeded the variable importance threshold. And what's quite interesting really is that it's not simply the case that one particular area of our control variables is accounting for most of this variance. So we can see quite selective relationships between specific personality traits, specific demographic variables, and then land use data as well. And this is all something we're kind of looking into in more depth as to like the sort of next techniques that we could use to really establish these models. But I think it's a really interesting insight into some of the drivers of this idea of urban ambience. Cool, so I've got a couple of minutes. I'm very quickly going to go through the kind of implications of this work, and then I'm more than happy to sort of discuss any questions that people might have, and yeah, go into some parts of it in a little bit more depth because I realized that we kind of raced through it. So, so one kind of area which we can kind of see this being applied to is around the idea of personalized recommendations. So if you think you can conceptualize a city in terms of different ambience dimensions, and there seems to be some relationship between ambience dimensions and personality traits. So if, for example, you were looking at you know, where to eat for an evening in New York City, you could look at which sort of neighborhoods kind of fit a particular ambience. You could look at the personality traits for those certain neighborhoods and see the alignment with your own personality traits. There is one serious caveat with this kind of idea of the application of this work, and that is, of course, the ecological fallacy. So we are looking here at aggregated neighborhood level personality and ambience scores. So we cannot infer individual relationships from this. However, it does sort of start to give some indication and potentially provide direction for future studies which are interested in individual level relationships between ambience and personality. And one sort of important paper, if you are interested in this work, is a paper by Sandra Matz over at Columbia Business School, which basically looked at how you can tailor targeting messages to a given individual personality trait. And it actually, in this case, it was via Facebook, and it basically increased click-through rates and purchase rates of a product through tailoring the marketing appeal to a given personality trait. So another sort of area that this could be applied to is looking into tracking urban change. So it's quite easy actually to add a temporal lens to the analysis here on urban ambience because the Flickr imaging data is time-stamped. And so one potential way that we could kind of use this data is to look at how an area has changed over time in terms of the dimensions that it's characterized by. And there's been some really innovative different methods of tracking urban change through sort of data science. So one by Glazer et al. A couple of years ago looked at Yelp data. So basically the presence of, actually it was like Starbucks. So the number of Starbucks in communities in New York City as basically a measure of gentrification. More recently, there was a sort of deep mapping gentrification paper which looked at Google Street View and could show from imaging data on Google Street View as to the rate of gentrification in different cities. But as the sort of authors kind of describe themselves, that there kind of suffers from the problem of being a slight delay here on when, you know, Google Street View updates its images versus when the changes have actually taken place. And then finally, just a couple of weeks ago at CASA, there's some excellent research looking at gentrification in London neighbourhoods and looking at numerous different sort of data points to try and place where on a sort of scale of gentrification different districts lie. Cool, and then the final sort of area that this could be applied to is basically playing a role in urban planning. So as a sort of case study here, this is a project in Brixton, which is looking at a redevelopment of an area of the market. And I just found this quite interesting because essentially a lot of community residents are very opposed to the plans. And as I was sort of looking through some of the community mobilization plans, which the project had tried to use, one of them was around sort of visual assessment. And so they looked at, the visual impact of, for example, this 22-story development project in terms of like the physical aspects. So looking at the height and looking at how it could be viewed from different areas. But I think the kind of interesting angle could be to apply some of this urban ambience work and kind of backcode it in some ways. So you would give people the taxonomy and you ask them to describe a proposed development in terms of different terms, which would link to the dimensions. And then you could look at the degree of sort of congruence between their description of a proposed development and of the current scores on urban ambience for that given district. And perhaps these sort of incongruence could be another kind of motivator for urban planners and developers to try and adjust their plans and ensure that it's kind of in line with resident preferences and in line with what residents kind of want from an urban renewal project. So that was a bit of a race through. I'm very happy to go back to any areas of interest for people, and we can talk through some of the slides in a little bit more depth. But thank you also to my collaborators at Cambridge, Nokia, and across in the US, who've all been very helpful on this work.